Today we're doing a review of the Kohler Barrington toilet. However, today we'll be taking a look at a second generation. I've always thought there's only two generations of the original Kohler Barrington lineup. However, there turns out to be three. So you have the first generation model, which is basically a back outlet Kohler Wellworth Waterguard, aka a 5th generation Kohler Wellworth, but it was using a 4th generation tank, which means it's using 5 gallons and not 3.5 gallons, which I likely assumed was meant to be a 3.5 gallon toilet originally, but they didn't go with it for whatever reason. Then you have this one, which is a 2nd generation, which is super rare. I mean, Barringtons in general are pretty rare, but this generation is especially rare. This was made around the mid-1980s, I'd say around circa 1985, and was made up until either circa 1988 or 1989. Which means it only ran for a couple years. Then you have the 3rd generation Barrington, which is basically the 6th generation Kohler Wellworth, aka the newer version of the Kohler Wellworth Waterguard. And that was basically that. It was just a back outlet 6th gen Wellworth. So, interestingly, this is actually a 3.5 gallon toilet. You could probably tell through the trapway and the bowl design, which is kind of like a hybrid mix between the 5th and 6th generation Kohler Wellworth, aka both of the Wellworth Waterguard models. But it also uses a 3.5 gallon tank this time, and not a 5 gallon tank. Not many of these toilets exist, so let's take a look at one of these and see what a 2nd generation Kohler Barrington has to offer. So the overall design really gives off that 5th generation Kohler Wellworth vibe. This looks exactly like a Wellworth Waterguard, except the tank is a lot larger. I definitely think the tank looks a lot better on this than, say, the original tank on the original Wellworth Waterguard. The base looks very similar to a Wellworth Waterguard too, except it's obviously back outlet. The trapway opening is basically a mix of both versions of the Kohler Wellworth Waterguard. You can kind of see a resemblance of the corn seed trap mixed in with the arch trap, but overall it's just another arch trap design. And right there is the siphon jet. So the tank is very interesting. With this particular one, it has an insulated tank, which I'm not so sure if it's standard with 2nd generation Barringtons, but this one has an insulated tank. You can also tell there is an elevated triangle shape right there, which you would see on something like the Kohler Highline, which is very strange for a Barrington to have. As you can tell, the handle is replaced, the fill valve is replaced with the Fluid Master one. I think the base and flapper might be original, but I'm not entirely sure. I would assume that the original fill valve would be a ball caulk, considering that most of them did have that, but outside of that, the parts can pretty much be interchanged. Let's have a look at a flush. Overall, I'd say the flush is okay. So there's an interesting quality aspect I would like to bring up, and that is the inconsistent flushes these things have. While it isn't as common as you probably think compared to something like the 3rd generation Mansfeld Altar I reviewed, I have noticed that this thing does have inconsistent flushes every now and then. Most of the time the flushes on these are generally fast, but as you saw with the last flush, it can sometimes be a little slow, which is a bit weird, and I don't know why this happens. But it is a weird quality issue I have noticed. It isn't anything detrimental, but it is a weird quality overall. Let's see if I can demonstrate this. See, with that flush, it was a lot faster. With that in mind, I'd say the pulling factor overall is just okay. If it wasn't for the inconsistent flushes, and it always flushed pretty fast like it mostly does, I would say that the pulling factor would be pretty decent. But considering that the flushes can be sometimes inconsistent, It does kind of reduce it a little bit, but it's nowhere near as terrible as some other toilets I put up with. The performance is also just okay. Like, it's far from the worst I've seen, but it could definitely be a lot better, which isn't shocking considering that the earlier Wellworth Waterguard, and of course the first generation Barrington, was not known for performing all the best, due to the weird, smaller trapway opening and trapway passages. Like I said, it's far from the worst, but it could definitely be a lot better. And now for my personal opinion, the weakest part of this toilet, the bowl rinse. The bowl rinse isn't the best. It seems okay overall, but I've noticed that the back rim especially struggles to get a little bit of rinse until like later in the flush. If this thing had a couple more rim jits, I definitely think the bowl rinse would be pretty decent, but as it is, it's a little bit lackluster. Here's another angle. And one more angle. And that is the second generation Kohler Barrington toilet. A very interesting toilet that not a lot of people know about. Now, this is far from the best toilet. It definitely has some lackluster qualities and some things that could have been improved upon. But overall, it is a very interesting toilet, and one that you'll rarely ever see. But let's put this toilet into the grading scale. Let's grade it. So the overall design of this toilet looks very similar to a 5th generation Wellworth, except its back outlet and the tank is taller. But besides that, it really isn't much different. I give it a 6. The tank parts for the most part are pretty fine. I will say though that I'm not the biggest fan of ball cock fill valves compared to some other people. I just find their reliability to be very questionable, even though they were very common. But ignoring that, the parts seem to work very well and can be interchanged at any time. So I give it a 6. The quality control really is not the greatest on these toilets. It's nowhere near as bad as the 3.5 Kohler Welcome, which has some inconsistent quality control, but it's still pretty in the middle. You would probably think I would be pointing out performance, but that's not my main point. My main 2 points is the inconsistent flushes and the rim jets. Mostly I've noticed that the flushes can be very inconsistent from time to time, sometimes being shorter or longer than others. While this is a little bit more minuscule compared to some other toilets I reviewed like the 3rd generation Mansfield Alto, I have noticed that the siphons tend to be a little bit more inconsistent compared to the flushes, sometimes being shorter or longer than others. At least it's not ridiculously short, I'll give it that, but it is definitely noticeable from time to time. Another issue I would like to point out are the rim jets. While it's nowhere near as crazy as the 3.5 Welcome, you can definitely notice some problems here or there sometimes. With this particular one I reviewed, the back rim jets just seem to be a little bit inconsistent. You notice that they really don't work as well compared to some others. Now it might just be a few, but you can definitely notice. With another one I put up with recently, I have noticed that one of the rim jets towards the front squirts out to wherever. It seems to be a major quality defect I've noticed with some of these toilets. So the quality control really isn't that perfect. I give it a 5. The trapway is not the best, but not the worst. It's virtually the same as a 5th generation Wellworth, but back outlet. The only difference being the trapway opening is a little bit larger, but not by that much. I give it a 5. The flush for the most part is just okay. It may not be the most exciting flush, but I appreciate that it's faster compared to some other toilets, and not super sluggish. I give it a 6. The pulling and siphon power for the most part is just okay. The pulling factor is actually pretty decent, but the inconsistent siphons do interfere with the pulling and siphon power overall. Even if the siphons are longer than other toilets, it can be interfered by the quality of this toilet, which, like I said, is not the greatest. Overall, I have to give it a 6. The performance is also just okay. Generally speaking, 5th generation Wellworth designs are not really well known for performing all the best. But I definitely think out of all of them, maybe outside the 3.5 Welcome, This is definitely one of the strongest performing ones, but in comparison to some other toilets made by Kohler, it's definitely one of the weaker ones. It's not terrible, but it could be a lot stronger. This mostly has to do with the trapway design being kind of small compared to some other toilets. But in all honesty, I've seen a lot worse. I give it a 6. In my opinion, the most disappointing part is the bowl rinse. It's far from the worst, but you would expect better for a swirly toilet. The right side definitely has some pretty strong rinsing power, but the left side just looks very lackluster. And if you have some back rim jets that don't function, the back rim can struggle a little bit. Had the bowl rinse and the quality control been a lot better, the bowl rinse could have easily been a 7, but the most you can give it is a 6. Not a deal breaker, but very disappointing. Despite some of the drawbacks, these things have some pretty decent survivability. Even if they are extremely rare compared to some other toilets, the place I'm reviewing this at has most of these still intact, with very few replacements, which is a very good sign. Overall, I give it a 7. Now let's talk about the overall value of this toilet. I definitely think this is one of those toilets where the rarity and the design of this toilet is a lot more interesting than the actual toilet itself. While I'm not saying it's a bad toilet by any means necessary, it's just a little bit more lackluster in comparison to some other fixtures from the time, with the flush, ball rinse, performance, and all the rest just being at most okay. While I definitely think this thing could have easily been improved upon, I at least respect it for being one of the more stronger designs of the 5th generation Wellworth, which is not really well liked outside the 3.5 color welcome. And unlike the 1st generation Barrington, it is an actual 3.5 gallon toilet not using 5 gallons. Is it the strongest? No, not at all. But at least it has some interesting and neat factors to it. Overall, I give the value a 6. The final score of the 2nd generation Kohler Barrington toilet is a 59 out of 100. While it's definitely not the strongest toilet out there, I can at least respect it for being a slightly stronger version of the 5th generation Wellworth. While I definitely think the 3.5 gallon Kohler welcome is superior even though it has absolute crap quality control, I can at least respect the features that this toilet offers, even if admittedly it's not the strongest.